Greetings, welcome back to another episode of Hope Without Limits. I'm your host, Jason Hughes. Today, I want to discuss, I want to continue along with our topic of the angelic conflict. It's such a big topic that it is very hard to summarize it. It is very hard to summarize the story and do it justice. I can summarize it, but there's just so many details that are involved in the story that I just don't want to miss it. Last Sunday in prep school, I had put two questions on the board. One of them was, why are we here on earth? Why is human beings here on this earth today? What was the purpose for which we were created? And the second question was a question that was posed by a student, and that was if Satan, or if God knew that Satan would sin even before he was created, why did he create him to begin with? Now I'm going to try to answer this question, and it may take several episodes. I'll try to get it into one. So to answer this question, it actually goes back to both questions, really. It actually goes back to one of my previous videos on the angelic conflict, specifically Satan's appeal to God's judgment. And I kind of give a hint as to the answer to those two questions. Why was mankind created? And if God knew that Satan would sin, why did he create him in the first place? And the answer to that has a lot to do with God's justice and also being made in the image of God. Now, there are two of God's creations that are made in the image of God. Number one is the angels, and number two, human beings. And in the beginning of Genesis, Moses is writing this book, and he's declaring God's message to us that we are made in the image of God, and we'll get to that. So to answer this question, those two questions, why did God allow Satan to exist if he knew if he was going to sin beforehand? And the answer to that question has a lot to do with the character of God. We call that's one of God's divine essence characteristics that we learn in prep school. And there's 10 major divine essence characteristics, and one of the main ones, two of them we're going to talk about today, but the main one that we're going to talk about to be able to answer that question about Satan is centered on God's justice. Now, what does God's justice have to do with him creating Satan to begin with? That it doesn't seem like there's no connection between the two, but there is. There's a lot of connections that the Bible ties together that we may not think about, but they have a lot of relevance. So, first of all, what is God's justice anyway? What is justice in general? What is God's justice? Well, number one, justice is a part of who God is in his very nature, is who he is and how he thinks. And just reading a psalm, let me read to you Psalm 25, verse 8. This is one of many Bible passages that declares God's justice. It says this. It says, God is fair and just, fair and just, they go together. He continues on by saying, he corrects the misdirected and he sends them the right direction. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. So justice, what is it? Psalm 25:8, the verse I just says, it says that he is fair. And justice is actually found all throughout the Bible. You can find it in the book of Genesis in the 2nd chapter, and which we're going to get into in the next video. And you also see a lot of it in the book of Revelation. So God's justice is everywhere. Now, there is one other divine essence characteristic that goes along with his justice, and that is his righteousness. Now, what is righteousness anyway? Well, it's God's absolute perfection, I guess that's what you can call it. It is his sinlessness. It's not just what he does, it's who he is. He is absolutely perfect. He is without sin. He is not able to sin. All of these describe God's righteousness. It is a perfect standard in everything that he thinks, everything that he says, and everything that he does. Now, God's justice is the execution of his righteousness. Now, what I mean by that is when I say that God's justice is the execution of his righteousness, which may sound like a nebulous description, it's God's justice is his response to anything that stands opposed to his perfect righteousness. And it also approves or confirms anything that is consistent with his righteousness. To say it another way, his justice corrects or punishes anything that opposes his character or goes against his character, but it also rewards anything or anybody that operates consistent with his character. Because God is perfect, he is without sin. A sinless person and all perfect God, they have two different natures. They're like completely going in opposite directions. They completely separate from one another. It's kind of like oil and water. You can put two of them together, and maybe you can try that in an experiment. Just take some vegetable oil and water and mix it up and try to shake it up as best you can. And no matter how hard you try, those two are going to separate. Those two are going to separate. All right. Now, I had to go into a little bit of an explanation, because to be able to understand why mankind was created and why God allowed Satan or even us to exist in the first place, even though he knew that we would sin, we have to kind of know what justice is, because justice helps us to answer those questions. Now, whenever God had created Satan and he also created mankind, he created him with what we call volition or free will. And that just means that we have the ability to make choices. We have the ability to choose I want chocolate ice cream today. I want vanilla ice cream tomorrow. I want to accept God's plan or I want to reject God's plan. Those are choices. It's very different from the animal kingdom, which are created with instincts. They just, God built into their bodies, into their minds, certain things that they just do by instinct. It's like they don't have to choose to do it. They just do it because they have those instincts. That's something that is ingrained inside of them. But human beings and angels are very different. We have choice. Now, I'm going to give you the short answer as to why God allowed Satan to exist, even though he knew he would sin. And the answer is this, is because as perfect justice, God allows us to make decisions, and those decisions have to take their course, be it good consequences or bad consequences. So let me just give you an example. So if I'm working on something, if I'm making like a little creation, maybe like a clay pot or something like that, and I'm making it and I'm just like, and I mess up, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to throw it away. Forget about it. That's not justice. Let me give you a human example. The clay pot was probably a bad example. So let's say that someone commits a robbery. That criminal is caught, put in jail, and then is brought before a judge, and the judge says, "All right, you get 2 years in jail, but you know what? Let's just forget about it. Let's just forget about it." Is that justice? No, that's not justice. Because that judge just wants to completely forget about what had happened. He just wants to completely forget about it. He doesn't want to correct it. He doesn't want to correct what happened. He doesn't want to administer consequences for those decisions. He just says, forget about it. Don't worry about it. That's not justice. Now God allowed Satan to exist in order to demonstrate his justice, his perfect character. Now, if Satan was created and he sinned and God said, I messed up on Satan, I'm going to throw him away. That's not God's justice. That's like admitting, that would be like God saying that he screwed up, which God does not screw up. He does not create anything sinful. He does not create anything bad. Now, we make bad choices, but he himself doesn't create anything bad at all. So don't think that God had created something sinful. He did not. He created us with choice to choose, but he himself didn't create anything bad. Because we came from him, Adam and Eve, they were created perfect. They were created without sin, I should say. So there's the answer to that question. It's a partial answer. The reason why God allowed Satan to exist, even though he knew he was going to sin, is because in order for God's justice to be made manifest, to be on display, to be demonstrated to the angels and eventually to mankind, is that the reason why he allowed him to exist is so God's justice will be demonstrated, to be demonstrated. And for God's justice to be demonstrated, the decisions that we make, the decisions that the angels make, they have to run their course. good decisions or bad decisions. They have to run their course, and there will be consequences for any decisions that come about. So that's the answer to that question as to why God allowed Satan to exist. Is that I'm repeating myself quite a bit just because I want to make sure that that this is heard and understood, and we're going to be going over this again. God allowed Satan to exist because his justice, God's justice, was going to be demonstrated. Now, with that in mind, let's go back to Satan's appeal. Now, when Satan's heart was filled with pride, with iniquity, with sin, with violence, with rebellion in his heart, and with this plan to try to kick God off of his throne and take the position of God, which was going to be impossible, but he was going to try to do that. Whenever Satan did all that, God's justice acted. And this wasn't just some little old infraction. This wasn't just something minor. This was something major. Satan made his decision that he didn't want to have anything to do with God. And God's justice said, "You're gone. You're gone." And God made a perfect decision to kick him out of heaven. And he was going to be thrown into the lake of fire. But here's the thing. Even though that he in the future is going to be thrown into the lake of fire, he's not there at this present time. Why isn't he there? Now, the reason why he's not in the lake of fire right now is because, based on some certain scripture passages and the descriptions of Satan's name, as well as the devil, which I'll go into here shortly, Satan filed an appeal. He made an accusation against the character of God. And that's what the name Satan means. It means accuser, or one who stands opposed. He made some accusations against the character of God, probably that God was not very loving to have sentenced him to the lake of fire. It sounds like a horrible place, and it is. It's a very horrible place. So Satan was making false accusations and slandering God's character, calling him names, and I think Ezekiel mentions that he got violent with God. So, and that's what the name devil actually means, slanderer, one who makes false accusations, and that's what the devil did. He made false accusations against the character of God, calling him unloving and unjust. And we actually see that in certain places of Scripture, like in the book of Job and Genesis chapter 3, where we see Satan appear for the first time to tempt Eve. We see some shots made against God's character, but we'll get into that another day. Excuse me. My eyes are a little bit dry. Okay, so Satan appealed God's decision. He accused God of being unloving. Accused him of being unloving. He says, "God, I don't think that you were being fair. I don't think that you were being loving." So he made some accusations against him. And Satan had convinced a third of the angels, about 33% of the angels, to follow him in his plan to try to get God off his throne and prove God to be a liar and an unloving God. So Satan challenged God's decision to send him to the lake of fire. So God's decision was perfect. There was no higher court that Satan could go to complain to. So what did God do? He actually created the human race as a response to this conflict that was going on between God and Satan. God and Satan. All right, so in next video, we'll get more into that. Specifically, we're going to focus on the creation of the human race and how it even solves the problem of the angelic conflict, the war between God and Satan. Tune in next time.